Good evening. Please welcome to the stage the Director of Public Engagement of the Free Library of Philadelphia Foundation, Oscar Almonte Espinal.
Hello everyone. Welcome to this very exciting author event. I am pleased to join you to introduce our extending guest tonight. But before we get to the program, I want to say a few words about our organization. The foundation works together with the Free Library to support programming and advance its mission of promoting literacy throughout the Philadelphia region. As a nonprofit, we are relying upon your support to achieve these goals. So please consider donating, which you can also do through our website, freelibraryfoundation.org. I will also take this time to thank a few people and organizations. I would like to thank Uncle Bobby's, our partner bookseller. A little background about me: I used to work at Uncle Bobby's as a bookseller, so I always like to shout them out. And the Philadelphia Citizen, our media partner. I also like to give a special thanks to the volunteers, a dedicated group of library patrons who help us run this incredible series. Yes. A little bit about our guest tonight. Matthew F. Delmont is the Sherman Fairchild Distinguished Professor of History at Dartmouth College, a Guggenheim Fellow and expert on African American history and the history of civil rights. He is the author of 5 books, most recently, Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad. His work has also appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic, Washington Post, and several academic journals, and on NPR. Originally from Minneapolis, Minnesota, Delmont earned his BA from Harvard University and his MA and PhD from Brown University. Mr. Delmont joins us tonight to talk about his newest book, Until the Last Gun is Silent, a story of patriotism, the Vietnam War, and the fight to save America's soul. Tonight's author will be in conversation with Richard Brookshire, who is a multi-hyphenated storyteller and nationally recognized political communication strategist. As a co-CEO and co-founder of the Black Veterans Project, his work is advancing institutional reform around racial equity and the case for reparations for Black veterans and military families. Please join me in welcoming tonight's guest.
Hello, hi everybody. So this is my first book talk, so I'm excited about it, but also slightly nervous. And I wanted to thank you again for having me. And I wanted to first start by recognizing any veterans in the audience. If you want to just stand up, I want to give everybody who's a veteran a round of applause. Veterans in the audience, there you go. All right, so I want to start because I really think to contextualize this book and fully understand it, it begins with your last book, Half American, and the Double Victory campaign and the fight against fascism at home and abroad, and specifically like the desegregation that ended up happening in 1948. So if you can just kind of contextualize, because there was a 20-year period between the end of World War II, kind of the beginning of the Vietnam conflict, and I think folks should understand like the New World Order that materialized and how the military was shifting and the kind of as the one of the major victories of the civil rights movement, one of the first major victories was desegregation.
Yeah. Let me also start by echoing Richard's thanks to y'all for coming out tonight. It's good to be in the company of people who love history, and so glad to have you here. And I want to thank Richard for coming up from DC to join me in conversation. We were talking backstage. We've done almost a half dozen Zoom conversations for different things over the last couple of years, but it's the first time meeting in person, so yeah. It's good to have this opportunity.
Absolutely.
Thanks for asking. So my last book project was called Half American. It was about Black Americans in World War II. And the title of that book came from a letter written by a man named James G. Thompson, who was a 26-year-old from Wichita, Kansas. It was late December 1941, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. He writes this amazing letter to the Pittsburgh Courier, where he asks in part, should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Is the America I know worth defending? And that phrase, should I sacrifice my life to live half American, it stuck with me. It's why I chose Half American as the title of the book. The question he was asking was the question was on the minds of a lot of Black Americans at the time. what does it mean to be asked to fight for, potentially die for a country that treats you as a second-class citizen? The Pittsburgh Courier used Thompson's letter to launch what was called the Double Victory Campaign, which, as you mentioned, meant victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. And I think it's important to understand it wasn't just a clever slogan or rhetorical device. It really was how Black Americans approached World War II. They were absolutely committed to military victory. More than 1 million Black Americans served in World War II, but they also recognized that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to defeat fascism and racism abroad and then come home and not have freedom and democracy here in the United States. And so that last book tried to tell those intertwined stories of the battles against fascism abroad, but then the battles against racism here in the United States. Importantly, by 1948, civil rights activists, Black Americans, are eventually successful in persuading the president to sign an executive order that starts the desegregation of the military. During World War II, the entire military is racially segregated, and there's no reason for that. There's no strategic or tactical reason. It was just meant to maintain the second-class citizenship of Black Americans. But after President Truman signs that executive order in 1948, it starts a process that does put the military on a more forward-looking trajectory with regards to integration. They move earlier and faster than most of higher education does, most corporations do, to try to put together a fighting force that actually draws on the capacities of all Americans. And so, in many ways, this current book about Vietnam moves that story forward 2 decades. By the Vietnam era, the military is rightly patting themselves on the back, saying, look, we're the most integrated institution in American society. And it's largely true. You have a generation of Black Americans who have more access to leadership roles in the military, who are able to take on a wider range of responsibilities in the military than they had just 2 decades earlier. But I think, as we'll probably talk about, that was one side of the story. There was also the side of the story that was about the racism that still existed in the military that a lot of troops encountered on a sort of day-to-day basis.
So there's been tons of books written about the Vietnam War. And like you said, you wanted to, we were chatting backstage and you were talking about how in framing up Half American, you wanted to juxtapose the story of activism at home with kind of the fight abroad for an equitable service or the ability to serve equitably. And I was curious why you chose to juxtapose the story of Coretta Scott King, because I wasn't actually even aware of the depth of Coretta Scott King's activism, right? It seemed like it was erased from history almost. So this book does a really great job of cultivating that narrative. And then also why you chose Skip's story. Yeah. So give us a little bit of color about that.
Yeah, so the book is structured around these 2 main characters, Coretta Scott King in the anti-war movement, and then Skip Johnson, who was a young Black man from Detroit who earned the Medal of Honor. I knew in approaching the book that I wanted to tell both a military history and an anti-war story. I think too often we separate those stories, but if you think about how that period was lived, they were intertwined. Most people in their families had some connection to the military and probably had some connection to someone who was opposing the war. I decided to focus on Coretta Scott King because the more I dug into her story, I realized that she hasn't gotten the credit she deserves as a tremendous activist in her own right. If I were to ask for a show of hands, hopefully most people are familiar with the name Coretta Scott King, but they might only know her as the wife and then widow of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But when you actually look into the records, she had a tremendous history as an activist herself. And so the book traces her genealogy as an activist, starting as a college student in Antioch in Ohio, when she joined the local NAACP. She attended the Progressive Party's political convention in 1948, where she met Paul Robeson, the famous actor and activist who became her lifelong role model. And by the time Coretta meets Martin in Boston in 1951, she's already, in many ways, further ahead than he is in terms of being an activist. She's a committed pacifist, and part of what he finds attractive about her is her worldliness and how committed she is to visions of justice. And so the book tries to tell that story of her activism. As you get into the Vietnam era, she is truly front and center in almost every major protest against the war during the Vietnam era. She's out there earlier than almost any other civil rights activist. She's cajoling her husband to stand up and speak out against the war, which he finally does in 1967 with the Beyond Vietnam speech at Riverside Church. But when you start to look into the sort of newspapers of the time, archival documents, she deserves a lot more credit than she's received so far. If I can offer one anecdote on this, part of it's how you search as a historian for this material. So if you look at historical newspaper databases, when I searched for Coretta Scott King, I got about 300 results. When I searched for Mrs. Martin Luther King Jr., I got 1,000 results, 3 times as many. Because that's how she was referred to in the press of the era, even when she was the person on stage speaking to 20,000 people. And so when you start to see all these places she was, you get just a tremendous respect for what a visionary leader she was, what a brave leader she was, and how she moved millions of Americans to stand up together to oppose the war. So she's the anti-war voice in the book. On the military side, I wanted to focus on someone who was really indicative or illustrative of what it meant to serve in the military during the Vietnam era. So Skip Johnson was a young working class man from Detroit. He grew up in the Jeffries Projects, was drafted just after he finished high school in 1966, served in a tank battalion, the 69th Armored Division. And so demographically, his story resembled a lot of working class stories of the men who were drafted into Vietnam. What was unique about his story is when his unit was caught in an ambush in 1968, he fought his way out of it, helped to save the lives of many men in his unit, and for that received the Medal of Honor. When he came back home, we'll talk about later, I think, he had a really challenging time. Like many men of that generation, veterans of that generation, he suffered from nightmares and the trauma he experienced in war. And because he had won the Medal of Honor, he was still being trotted out by the Army as a recruiter and as someone to kind of symbolize the heroism of the Vietnam War. And in many cases, the Army was more interested in his medal than they were in the man. They didn't take care of the wounds that he experienced. And so I try to trace that story for Skip to talk about his bravery, his sacrifice, but then not only what the war cost him, but what the war cost his family. He had a wife and a young son. And so when we think about the costs of the war, it wasn't just the veterans who lost their lives in the battle, but it was those whose lives were irreparably damaged by it, but also the family members who had to suffer because of that.
I think one of the interesting things about the book as well is how you build on a bit of an analysis of obviously the victories of the civil rights movement, but how it was transitioning into the Great Society, and how the Vietnam War kind of directly challenged the ability for the Great Society to really meet its objectives. Can you give a little color about what the Great Society program was, how it built out from the civil rights movement, and how the Vietnam conflict really intervened on the war on poverty?
Yeah. So one of the reasons Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights activists were so reluctant to speak out against the Vietnam War is they didn't want to alienate President Johnson. They thought anything that we do to mess up our relationship with the White House is going to have negative implications not just for civil rights movement and the legislation we're trying to get passed, but it's going to have negative implications for the Great Society programs that President Johnson's introducing, particularly the war on poverty. And so there was a sort of trade-off between foreign policy issues and domestic issues. And people are generally familiar with Martin Luther King's Beyond Vietnam speech in 1967, but 2 years earlier, he started to kind of dip his toe in the water of speaking out against Vietnam in 1965. As soon as he did that, he was chastised by politicians and by the media for getting out of his lane. Senator Dodd from Connecticut had this impassioned attack on him that showed up in all the major newspapers at the time, saying Dr. King doesn't know what he's talking about. He's a civil rights leader. He knows domestic issues. He knows black issues. He doesn't know anything about what's going on in Vietnam, doesn't know about foreign policy. And so that really was one of the reasons that he kept, that Dr. King stopped talking about the war for nearly 2 years until 1967. The war on poverty was important also because a point that Coretta and others kept making was all this money that we're spending in Vietnam could be better spent here in the United States. And so eventually, as the war in Vietnam escalated and took more and more resources, it led to the end of the war on poverty. It's what really undermined the war on poverty, meant more people were going to go hungry, more people were going to be without homes, without health care, without job programs. And so Coretta and others rightly identified that there was a calculus that was going on, that the country had to make a choice in terms of where it was going to dedicate resources. And sadly, both for that time period but for the future of the country, more resources were dedicated to fighting the Vietnam War than they were taking care of people in need here in the United States.
I think one of the figures that stood out to me that MLK mentioned in a speech was that about $322,000 was spent for every enemy killed, but only $53 per person was spent on the war on poverty, on citizens in the country. So that was really illuminating. So let's shift gears just a little bit to Project 100,000. So obviously, during World War II, and likely obviously before that, there was this push to try to get black service members the ability to have the same levels of opportunity in uniform, and you have really during the Vietnam era basically a proliferation, and then a specific project to recruit black service members. One of the things that I also found really interesting in reading was the framing that McNamara, the Secretary McNamara, had at the time in legitimizing Project 100,000 or legitimizing the war even by saying that it was a jobs program. And so could you speak more about that and what Project 100,000 intended to do?
Yeah, so it connects directly to the discussion of the war on poverty, because for McNamara, he believed that the way to solve the war on poverty, the way to solve unemployment, particularly for young black men, young Latino men, and young working class white men, was to draft them into the military. So they developed this program called Project 100,000. And the goal was to be able to bring in 100,000 new men into the military, but particularly drawn from what they called these poverty-encrusted backgrounds. Mm-hmm. So they went particularly looking for young men who might have failed either the physicals or failed the educational testing they would have needed to get into the military through the regular draft, but tried to use this as a kind of backdoor way to recruit more men into the military. But they explicitly saw it as a social program, in the way they framed it. It was linked to some of the work that Daniel Moynihan had done with the work on the Negro family, where they talked about the culture of poverty. They said, the way we're going to solve this culture of poverty is we're going to bring these young black men into an institution that has strong male leadership, strong values. This will be the thing that not only gets us more men in the military, but it'll solve some of these social problems at home. Over the long term, it had a negative impact on the men who were drafted because they were brought into the military in these programs, but there was no structured support to help them succeed either in the military or afterwards. There was no real job train that happened. They would put them in infantry units, and then if they weren't wounded or killed in the military, they would be sent back to Chicago, to Los Angeles, to Detroit, and there were no jobs for them on the other side either. And so, as it's structured in the story, they were in many ways looking for men like Skip Johnson, the man I mentioned that is the focus of my story. He was a young working class man from Detroit who was demographically very similar to the young men who were brought into the military through Project 100,000.
So let's shift back to the work of Coretta Scott King in bridging the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and how it was received, right? It's a real threat to power to unite these two movements, and there was a lot of pushback on trying to unite them. Can you speak a bit about that? And I'll just mention a quote that stuck with me from Bob Moses from SNCC, who said that Negroes were better than anyone else, Negroes better than anyone else are in a position to question the war, not because they understand the war better, but because they understand the United States. So I feel like that, speak to that a little bit.
Great quote. So the book starts with Coretta Scott King at Madison Square Garden in 1965. At a protest rally, an emergency rally against Vietnam, organized by Bayard Rustin, the famous civil rights activist. But Coretta Scott King is the only woman invited to speak there and the only black woman invited to speak there. And she's, beyond Bayard Rustin, the only sort of civil rights leader who feels comfortable getting on stage and speaking out against the war in Vietnam at that time. The important work she was doing was trying to build bridges between the civil rights movement and the peace movement, and that these had too often been developed as sort of separate constituencies, but she saw as part of her job trying to link the two movements, both in terms of her organizing, but also in terms of how she framed her resistance to the war. And I think one of the things that's powerful about her anti-war critique is it wasn't just about peace. She was absolutely committed to peace, but she had a multifaceted critique of the Vietnam War. She really understood it as being an extension of colonialism, that Vietnam, like so many other countries that had won their independence, was trying to fight and maintain their independence. That they didn't want to be locked into this Cold War mindset where they had to choose between the United States or the Soviet Union. And she rejected this idea of the domino theory, that every nation that fell to communism was going to be a potential long-term threat to the United States. She felt comfortable speaking on issues of foreign policy because she was widely traveled and widely read. She had traveled more at that point than President Johnson had. Right? She'd been all over the country, or all over the world, had spent time meeting world leaders alongside Martin, and was well read on the history of the French military disasters in Vietnam. So she understood that was going to be a problem as well. And then, because she understood where the money was going to the Vietnam War, she kept making this point that we have to make choices. Right? We have to make choices about where we dedicate resources. And so when she was on these stages at Madison Square Garden or later in Central Park and in leading all these different rallies, she kept trying to hammer home for people that as citizens, we have to make decisions about where the country's going to dedicate these resources. And they're much better spent helping people in the United States than they are fighting these wars abroad.
Going back to Project 100,000, one of the things that really struck me was obviously there was a lot of stats about how black folks were dying at some of the highest rates, especially toward the beginning of the war. And I hadn't actually known that. I think there was something that made mention of the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan of Louisiana leading like the draft board, right? And have the major protests that then kind of spurred from that. So as I think that, there's also these kind of storied civil rights groups who were very much of the mind, it seemed, that there needed to be direct support and they needed to be in alignment with the Johnson administration and wanting to preserve that relationship, so not wanting to come out against President Johnson publicly. So I say all that to say that, can you speak about how Coretta assisted Martin's evolution of thought, but also hopefully developing his courage to ultimately come out and speak out against the war as it became kind of an increasing racial justice issue, and the degree to which Martin Luther King faced backlash from the public and from his peers?
So I can approach it in two ways. One thing that Coretta Scott King said consistently was that we're a country that's gone from one war to the next. So she talked about how for her generation it had been World War II to Korea to the Cuban Missile Crisis to the Cold War and then into Vietnam. And her concern was not just the increasing and persistent militarism of American life, but how veterans, particularly black veterans, weren't cared for when they came home. And so that's part of the point she kept trying to make publicly, but also to Martin, that this was a racial justice issue because you were going to have another generation of black veterans being asked to fight the nation's wars and then being largely ignored or discarded when they came home. The other piece that was really important for her was when Martin Luther King won the Nobel Prize in 1964. She saw that as a huge challenge to both of them. She described it as being scary because she thought this is a calling for us, that it's not just about the civil rights movement anymore, but it's about something much broader, about a global human rights campaign, about peace globally. And so from that point forward, she consistently challenged Martin to see that as the bar. That's not about just getting civil rights legislation passed, but it's about doing something that is truly going to change the structure of the world. And then I think like any couple, they talked about these issues over the dinner table, right? And she consistently cajoled him to be more forceful and more bold. And he gave her credit for that. There was a TV reporter who interviewed Martin in 1965 and sort of reflected on Coretta being in front of all these different groups talking about the war. And so the TV reporter said, you must have really influenced your wife on these issues. He said, no, you've got it wrong. I'd like to be able to say that I influenced her to satisfy my masculine ego, is how he put it. But in many ways, she influenced me. She educated me. Right? After he gives that speech, the Beyond Vietnam speech in April of 1967, almost everyone attacks him for it. Right? He's attacked by all the white politicians and press, which you would expect, but even most mainstream civil rights leaders attack him as well. People he's been close to, people he's marched with, even his own father is looking at him like, what have you done? Like, this is not the stand for you to make. You're going to lose all of your support. And the public polling showed that after Vietnam, for the rest of his life, he was largely viewed unfavorably by a lot of Americans. One of the few people who stood up for him was Coretta, because she understood, she was disappointed by the backlash, but understood this is about something much bigger, much more important, and she was proud that he stood up. After he gave that speech, then they started working together to oppose the war. He gave a major speech and led a march in New York City. At the same time, she was in San Francisco leading a parallel march. And so for her, it was kind of the culmination of her effort to kind of win the issue in her own household, right, to get him to finally speak up against the war.
So pivoting back to Skip's story, can we talk about his journey post-winning the Medal of Honor, how he was used essentially as a recruiting device, the perception that he got from different factions of the black community, and ultimately what led to his mental decline and ultimate death?
Yeah. So the ambush I mentioned where Skip performs the actions that win him the Medal of Honors in January of 1968. And one of the most challenging things for Vietnam-era veterans is immediately after he goes through that, he's back in the United States 48 hours later at a military hospital, and then back home in Detroit 2 weeks later, which was consistent with how most Vietnam veterans experienced their reentry to American society. There was no sort of decompression, no support for going from direct combat to being back at home. And that's how it was with Skip. Those 6 months after he got back from Vietnam, he doesn't hear anything from the Army. He's going about his life trying to sort of reestablish himself in Detroit. He really wants to be able to go to college. He wants to become a computer programmer. But for a 21-year-old black working class man from Detroit, that's not really in the cards. He's living with his mom at the time. He sees two military policemen start to walk up their driveway. And his mom shoots him a look like Skip, what have you done? It turns out they're there to make sure he hasn't done anything in the past 6 months. As soon as they question him and they leave, he gets a call from the White House letting him know he's won the Medal of Honor. Right? No one had told, this comes entirely out of the blue for him. Right? They tell him he's going to go to the White House 2 weeks later to receive this Medal of Honor. So the first time he's ever in Washington, D.C., he's there to go to the White House to receive the Medal of Honor from President Johnson. Right? Not only that, when they're reading the commendation describing the actions that he performed to earn the Medal of Honor, it's the first time he's heard anyone describe what he did in combat. He was in this sort of frenzied state when he experienced it, but now he's hearing someone describe this combat experience in front of the president and all these other dignitaries while he's receiving the Medal of Honor. His life changes after that moment. Remember, this is late 1968, and so there's a lot of investment in this black hero, right? Particularly for people in Detroit, because it's just a year and a half since the Detroit riots. There's a lot of investment in having him be the symbol of unity. And so he gets invited to dinners and celebrated by the governor of Michigan, by the mayor of Detroit, by the heads of Ford and all these other businesses, essentially on a banquet circuit. Right? Everyone wants to celebrate this black hero of Detroit. I mentioned earlier he wanted to be able to go to college, can't do that, can't get a job, and so eventually he signs up to be a recruiter for the Army. And they send him into primarily black schools, black high schools, to recruit other young black men to join the military. The thing that really turns for him is when there's the revelation about the atrocities at My Lai. That's, in his widow's accounting, that was the point that really sent him on this sort of downward spiral. He'd been struggling throughout with nightmares, with bleeding ulcers, but that's the thing that really leads to the deterioration of his own mental health. He checks himself into a military hospital, ends up at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. The very first day he's there, they have him get back dressed up in his military uniform with the Medal of Honor on to go shake hands. Right? And so part of the story I tell in the book is how the Army and the larger military apparatus and the sort of civic leaders of Detroit were really more invested in the medal than they were in the man. Right? They cared more about celebrating this idea of a hero than caring for the actual needs of Skip Johnson. The story that you read about in the book ends tragically. He was killed in an armed robbery attempt in Detroit when he was just 22 years old. The breakthrough for me in being able to tell Skip's story, if you were to Google him now, you would find the Medal of Honor story, and you would find the story about when he was killed in this armed robbery. But in telling his story, I wanted to try to tell a fuller version of his life. And so the big breakthrough for me was being able to interview his widow, Katrina, who's a fabulous, feisty woman who's in her 70s, lives just outside Detroit. And through her stories and through the stories of the men who served with Skip in the 69th, I was able to talk about kind of a fuller arc of his life, that he was a kind, caring young man. He was in the Glee Club and choir when he was in high school. I describe how he and Katrina fell in love, how they got married when he came back from Detroit. And then I describe what his death meant for her. She was a widow at 21. Their son, Christopher, was a year and a half years old. And so when I talk in the book about the cost of war, it's not just the cost for the veterans like Skip who served and who lost their lives, but the cost that Katrina had to bear for losing her loved one in that.
Yeah. And speaking of Katrina, my next question was about her struggle to attain widow benefits, right? And then what the inevitable kind of decisions that came out in her favor. Can you speak about that?
Yeah. So one of the things I think is really powerful about Katrina's story is that she was relentless in fighting both for Skip's legacy, but also for the compensation she was deserved from the military. Because Skip wasn't killed in Vietnam, because he was killed back in Detroit, the Army didn't consider his death to be in the line of service, right? Which meant that Katrina got about $100 a month as opposed to getting $300 a month. She worked with a lawyer from the VA to fight against that. And the thing that was the breakthrough that helped them fight against that was the development of what came to be called PTSD. They call it at the time post-Vietnam syndrome. So one of the reasons Skip's story is important is that he was one of the first people diagnosed with post-Vietnam syndrome. The psychologist, Robert J. Lifton, who were helping to develop that diagnosis at the time, they pointed to Skip's story as they were talking about this all across the country. And they said, look, this is an example of someone who gave their life serving the country in the military, but then because of the trauma they experienced, lost their life afterwards. And so Skip's story was really pivotal in getting the VA and doctors more broadly to recognize PTSD as a medical diagnosis. It mattered for Katrina's story because that was the thing that allowed her to eventually get the VA to agree that Skip's death was in the line of service. And so it was the first case that found in favor of a widow with PTSD for her husband.
Can we also simultaneously talk about how, pivoting back to Coretta, how in Martin Luther King coming out publicly against the war more forcefully prompted Johnson to essentially have J. Edgar Hoover go after him kind of unfettered, and how that led to his death? Can you expound on that?
Yes, one of the reasons that Dr. King and most civil rights leaders were uncomfortable speaking out against the war is, like I mentioned earlier, they didn't want to offend and get on the wrong side of President Johnson because they understood that President Johnson had tremendous power to inflict harm on them. They also knew that the FBI was tracking every movement because just being involved with the civil rights movement made them arouse suspicions that they were either communists or communist sympathizers, all the more so if they critiqued the war. And so that's what happened. I mentioned earlier when Coretta Scott King spoke out at Madison Square Garden, that showed up in FBI files. They had a file on her just as they did on Martin Luther King Jr. After Dr. King gives that speech against Vietnam at Riverside Church in 1967, that leads to an escalation from J. Edgar Hoover, a series of direct attacks, attempts to undermine Dr. King, raise concerns about his infidelity, really trying to prompt him to commit suicide, and eventually turns many of the people who had worked with him against him. I think what's scary about it, it's scary at the time, but particularly scary in retrospect, is the amount of firepower that the federal government brought against these peace leaders, right, who were trying to help enhance freedom, equality for the United States, for all people in the United States. And so I think when we think about celebrating Dr. King's legacy or celebrating Coretta's legacy, we have to recognize the incredible bravery it took for them to stand up and speak out, knowing that they were being tracked and attacked in this way. And I think it's all the more powerful that they were unwilling to allow themselves to be characterized as un-American. I think one of the core ideas of the book is the relationship between patriotism and dissent. That Coretta was consistently saying, we're called to be patriotic, but for us being patriotic means we have to call the country to account. We have to be willing to dissent from things that are unjust and unright. She told a group of black college students that she loved the country, and that the country belonged to them, but they had to be willing to fight for it.
And I think to pivot just a little to post Martin Luther King's death, around Coretta's continued activism and her efficacy, she ended up leading to the largest protests in American history. Can you illuminate kind of how her continued activism helped to sustain pressure, specifically as presidencies changed from Johnson to Nixon, that inevitably led to the end of the war?
Yeah. So Dr. King was assassinated in April 1968. And those weeks after he was assassinated are just remarkable when you look at Coretta and what she did and where she had to travel. So the assassination obviously happened in Memphis. She travels from Memphis to Atlanta to bring the body back there, from Atlanta back to Memphis to lead a protest march that would have been led by Dr. King, from Memphis back to Atlanta for the funeral, and then back to Memphis. All that's while caring for 4 young children, of whom she's now a single mother. Right? 3 weeks after that, she's in Central Park leading a protest rally that was meant to be led by Dr. King, where she delivers a speech on the 10 anti-war commandments. It's where the title of the book comes from, because she says she vows to fight against the war until the last gun is silent. Right? But she's speaking there in front of 80,000 people in Central Park, right? Wearing black, essentially dresses a widow in mourning, but has this tremendous gravitas that she's bringing to the anti-war movement. That's in 1968. By 1969, she leads 2 of the largest protests in American history, the moratorium marches in October and November of 1969, including a candlelight march she leads in front of the White House. I think the thing that's important about the influence that she had, obviously the Vietnam War stretched until 1975, so it wasn't as though Coretta or any single person was able to get the war to end overnight. But the pressure that she put first on President Johnson and on President Nixon, it did constrain their options in terms of the kind of tactics they chose to implement, but also in terms of troop deployments. So Nixon did start to draw down troops sooner rather than later, in part because of the groundswell of opposition to the war. It didn't happen as quickly as Creda or others would have liked, but part of what was so powerful about her getting so many people out in the streets, and so many sort of average Americans out in the streets, that was the thing that scared President Nixon, scared President Johnson, that this wasn't just a set of radicals or militants, this was average everyday people who were in some cases protesting for the very first time, in part because they were made brave enough by Creda's leadership to feel comfortable going out in the streets to protest against their own government.
So what does this book teach us about American imperialism and protests? And more specifically, we've had about 24 military conflicts, which you name in the book, since the Vietnam War ended. What have we failed to learn as a society from the Vietnam era?
It's a good question. So one of the things I kind of conclude the book with is one of the reasons Coretta Scott King was so insistent on not just opposing Vietnam, but trying to understand the broader structures, that she wanted to make people aware that these foreign policy decisions mattered, right? And that the country was going to continue to be in these military adventures if citizens didn't raise their voice and be willing to stand up against foreign policy decisions that would end up costing the country. I think history, unfortunately, has proven her prophetic on that point, that most of my adult life, the United States has been at war, and it seems as though we're going to stay on that path unless something changes significantly. I think one thing we can learn is trying to understand how we keep getting into these places and why we refuse to learn from the past. And I think part of that is understanding I keep going back to this point, the cost of the military, cost of war, right? There's a human cost, a real human cost of who's serving in the military, who's suffering the casualties, and who's dying in the military, and the impact on their families, right? I think that's become less of a front page topic once the military became an all-volunteer force after 1973, but it's obviously deeply, deeply felt by military members and their families, and that's something that I think all Americans need to take into account and take seriously. And then there's a tremendous economic cost, right? It's no less important today than it was in the Vietnam era to pay attention to if we're spending all this money on planes, tanks, drones, everything else, that's money that's not being spent domestically to address the things that voters consistently say they want done. Right? And so there are real trade-offs that the country continues to make and continues, I think, unfortunately, to make choices that prioritize militarism over domestic spending. I think the other thing that Creda kept coming back to was trying to develop a peacetime economy that wasn't linked to the ramp up of military spending, right? And I think that's something that the country's continued to struggle with as well.
Thank you for that. So we want to pivot to audience questions now. So I'm sure that folks have, their minds are racing. So please, anyone who has a question, feel free to, please. They're coming around with the mic.
I was very,
Is it on?
is that on? Yeah, there we go. It's fascinating, but I was particularly struck by your comment at the beginning about when you were researching and you found the number of references to her as Dr. King's wife. Did you find anything in your research that, I mean, as a person of a certain age who lived through that era as a working woman, what did you learn about her attitude toward oppression of women, not just black women, but of women in general?
It's a really great question. So she was closely involved with a lot of other women activists in the era. She joined a group called Women Strike for Peace in 1962, which you might be familiar with. Traveled to Geneva to call for an end to nuclear testing. Right? And so she was working closely with a lot of women activists of the era. She had a more kind of parallel role in terms of the women's movement as it's generally defined, but she always understood that these issues were always intersecting, right? That for her, issues about poverty, about housing, about healthcare, they were women's issues, but they were also sort of people issues, right? She understood that these couldn't be teased apart. And she was always interested in trying to build bridges, right? So she was trying to think about what connects the civil rights movement to the women's movement, connects it to the issues that matter to Latinos, Native Americans, Asian Americans. I think the best example of this is probably the Poor People's Campaign that Dr. King was trying to lead before he was assassinated. She takes on a leadership role at that for a time, that movement does bring together a coalition of activists in 1968. One other thing I'll mention is that in it sort of how historians approach the work, a lot of the stories you'll read about her in the 1960s show up in the women's pages of newspapers, right? And what's fascinating about those is you get a whole range of what her life was like, because they'll be interviewing her and they'll talk about, what do you make your kids for breakfast? How do you sort of balance when your husband's out of town? But then they'll say, and I noticed that you spoke in front of 20,000 people at Madison Square Garden, right? And so there was no, it was just all sort of a piece of what it meant to be a woman leader in that era, right? And I think that's what makes her sort of all the more powerful. And when you read her own accounting of how she tried to navigate the civil rights movement, she was pissed a lot of the time, right? The March on Washington, right? She and all those other women know that that wouldn't have happened without them. And then when they're not invited to speak, right? When they're not invited to march in the week, there's a scene in the book, and I'm not the first one to describe it, where she's in a limo with Dr. King going to the White House, and she wants to be able to go in and meet President Kennedy, because she thinks, when else am I going to have an opportunity to meet a president? And Martin looks at her and says, you're not invited. Right? And so he gets out of the limo, goes to the White House, she goes back to the hotel. Right? She's pissed. Right? But I think that makes, when she ends up leading this candlelight march to challenge President Nixon outside of the White House, when she's speaking in front of 200,000 people, right, that makes her leadership, when she's the one in front, all the more powerful.
Sir, thank you very much for the history lesson. But usually, I learn in history, right? When you put history in a nutshell, sometimes you see much more than you understand even better. Once upon a time, the United States used to be a normal country where everybody eat from the fruit of his hand, right? Your hand is more fruitful than mine, right? So you eat more than what I do. So then the World War II happened, right? The United States one of a sudden became so rich, beyond richer than everybody else in the world. The money came to the United States. The Americans start to fight. What are you going to do with all this wealth that came to us? You said in the beginning of your speech that the military was the most unifying institution that was used to distribute that wealth that came to the United States, literally. White, black, usually, and the system was the draft. Usually, you draft 100 person and you only take 10. The drafting experience was some form of social vetting of the American, whether you will be taken or you will be left. So you have some form of connection with your government, right? Let's fast forward. Here come Nixon the crook. Delete the draft. So regardless the 100,000 man project, those people were supposed to go through that, were supposed to go officially to the draft, and so we were supposed to be rejected from the normal drafting process. Now they were shoved into the system, and then Nixon come. I think there is a reason why they call him Nixon the crook. That was the biggest thing that he raped the United States. The draft. Without the draft, you cannot have a country. What do you think?
Yeah, so thinking about the draft in particular, so the draft ends in 1973, becomes an all-volunteer force after that. And from that point forward, black Americans have always been overrepresented in the military, in part because they've seen, generally speaking, more opportunities in the military than in the private sector, right? And that we can have arguments about whether it's good or bad, but I think it's just sort of the structural reality of how it's played out. And people differ on this. I wouldn't be in favor of reinstituting the draft, but I think there is something about service, broadly defined, and what is lost in a country when that service isn't shared, right? I think just demographically, more working class folks are volunteering for military duty because there are relatively fewer opportunities, and this is across racial lines, relatively fewer opportunities in the private sector. And that's a challenging place for the country to be, right? I think having a sort of shared sense of service, shared sense of sacrifice is one of the things that might be able to unify a country at a time when there's so much disagreement about what can potentially hold us together.
This is the last question. Oh. Yeah. Make it good.
I think I have a good one, so we'll see. I think you started off by saying, talking about this appreciation for history, and I think we can all agree history does repeat itself, and I think for better or for worse, we can look back at history to learn about where we're at right now. So I'm curious, in researching this book and writing about this American imperialism, a country steeped in violence, and the ways we refer to American history through periods of war, right? I'm curious how that has informed what you're seeing today in America, and this pursuit of certain interests abroad while society is probably regressing here. So I'm curious how what you've researched over the several decades ago is repeating itself now.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think deep concerns about what I think are probably best term foreign policy adventures that draw so heavily on things that we've seen in recent American history and then in longer American history. That don't exhibit a thoughtfulness about what the downstream implications are going to be, right, or what the downstream costs are going to be. Again, not just economic terms, but in sort of the real human people terms. Mentioned at the outset, I'm from Minneapolis, and so thinking about everything that's going on there, and it's not unique to Minneapolis, right, but ICE and everything else there. One of the sort of core themes in the book is about patriotism and dissent, and what it means. So I keep coming back in the book, but also just in my own thinking, to what it means to fight for your country. Not just in the military sense, but in the kind of Prescott King fighting for a version of their country that you can be proud of, right? It takes a lot to stand up against your own government, or to defy or dissent from the policies that the government is putting in place. But I think we're called as citizens to do that, right? And I think it exhibits a care for the communities we're in, a care for the country that we're in. If there's something going on that you strongly disagree with, that you raise your voice against it. And I think that's one of the things I certainly take from the Prescott King story and the broader anti-war story, is that people at great cost to themselves and to their careers and their livelihoods were willing to stand up against the Vietnam War early. It took the country a long time to understand that it was a mistake. But they were willing to stand up against it early in a way that I think is paralleled with a lot of the anti-ICE protests we see going on now.
Yeah. So we want to thank the Free Library Foundation and the Free Library of Philadelphia. Thank you, Professor Delmont, and thank you for everybody for coming out. We're going to sign books out right outside the door.
I just want to say thank you also to everyone who's coming out. Richard does amazing work with the Black Veterans Project, so look him up, look up the work he does. And again, thank you so much, Richard, for joining.
Thank you.
Just a reminder to check the seat around you. People have been losing and leaving things in the auditorium. Want to make sure you leave with all your things. And once again, give our speakers a lovely round of applause. We really appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Go this way? Okay.
Oh, thank you.
That went well. We did it.
Yeah. You got your first time out of the way.
I got
huh?
my first time. I popped
That
the
was great.
cherry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. This is